Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the work session for Greeley Evans School District 6. It is 4:38 on Monday, September 25th. We're a little bit late starting our meeting, so if you've been waiting for us, we apologize for that. But we were concluding an executive session where we were discussing the superintendent's evaluation. If you want to hear more about that, you can hear more about that in our business meeting at 6 o'clock. But we are ready to go with our executive session now, and we will call the meeting to order. And Ms. Lemon, will you call the roll for us, please?
Director Bentley?
Present.
Director Campos-Spitzy?
Present.
Director Mash?
Present.
Director Matthews?
Present.
Director Norwood?
Present.
Director Pappas?
Present.
Director Sullivan?
Present.
All board members present.
Thank you, Ms. Lemon. Next on our agenda is our calendar review and community engagement. So there's a calendar in front of you. Take a quick look at that.
Just added today the Evans Chamber Business Before Hours that will be at Chapel Arts Magnet School. I have 7 on my calendar. Amy, is 7:30 correct?
7:30 is correct.
Oh,
Yes.
good. I get another 30 minutes.
That's probably your drive time.
Probably was my birthday.
I have one, Mr. President.
Yes, sir.
November the 11th is the Marine Corps Ball. And I visited with Major Kinsley over the weekend, and they're having one of the highest ranking, in fact, the highest ranking person ever to be their speaker. There's a Major General that is coming to be the guest of honor that night. So
Oh, fantastic.
it's November the 11th, social hours from 5 to 6. The ceremony starts at 6.
So Amy will need to follow up and verify invitations because we will need to RSVP for that event.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Norwood.
Yes, thanks, sir. Anything else that needs to be on here? We do have a school visit coming up, and that's on the 28th at Jefferson Junior. We have the Great Ed Luncheon on October 4th. CASB, I don't know how many are going to that, but October 6th and 7th. And District 6 Business Partner Appreciation Breakfast on the 13th, and Evans State of the City Address on the 20th. And a board visit to Jefferson High School in the CTE Center. I'm sorry I skipped over that, but that's October 10th. And that gets us up through most of October. The Weld Community Foundation Lunch is at the end of October on October 26th. So just pay attention to those dates. They should all be calendar invites on your calendar, but just so everybody else knows what we're doing. Getting busy season for us. Anything else needs to be on there? All right. Well, moving right along, we are now to our CASB legislative resolution discussion. I see Mr. Fall coming forward, so I imagine you're going to have some information for us on our CASB legislative resolutions.
Thank you, President Matthews and members of the board. So today we're going to talk about the 83rd Annual CASB Fall Conference and Delegate Assembly. Our delegate for this school district is Director Mash, and I would maybe defer or ask Director Mash to shed some light on this process as we're getting into it. But the legislative session is upon us, and we are working to get ready for it. So the 83rd Annual CASB Fall Conference and Delegate Assembly will be held on October 7th. It's going to be held in Glenwood Springs, and they're going to be talking about all things legislation. Of course, there are 9 standing resolutions issued by CASB, as well as 3 federal standing resolutions. And then there are 37 proposed legislative session resolutions for this upcoming delegate assembly. We are going to go over all of them today. We're not going to go over all of them in great detail. And there are a few that I will really just defer to Director Mash to use her best judgment at the delegate assembly in terms of voting. But just so you're aware, as a member of the Colorado Association of School Boards, they have a delegate assembly. As part of that delegate assembly, they back or support certain types of legislation for the upcoming legislative session. These are not bills. They're more kind of ideas or topics that will be included as legislation in the upcoming session. So these are just kind of topics of areas that they want to work with lawmakers to create legislation or to amend legislation moving forward. So these are really just kind of their main topics. So does that all make sense? Did I explain that, Director Mesh? That's pretty much how it
Yeah,
is?
so then our CASB lobbyist takes the resolutions that the CASB delegation has said they're in favor of, and then, yeah, I think you kind of said that speaks to the legislature, but it's kind of that collective power of the school boards of Colorado have said this.
Yeah, and so CASB, as just one lobbying arm of schools in Colorado, I think really is one of the more influential organizations in Colorado to influence change in terms of support for K-12 public education. And so this is really a good organization and a good group to get behind in terms of making changes to the law. So these are just the standing resolutions. I'm not going to go through each and every single one of these. I did share a copy of the resolution booklet with all of you. If you are curious and you want to know more about these standing resolutions, I encourage you to go in and read through them. But these are every year. CASB backs these similar standing resolutions to support systems of accountability, to make our assessment system and our accountability system improved for years to come, things of that nature. Of course, we don't want to have any mandates in place that are unfunded and cause a lot of challenges for school districts to come into compliance, things of that nature. So again, if you are interested in what these standing resolutions are, or if you have any questions, just reach out to me and I can shed some more light on that. And these are the federal standing resolutions. So much like the state standing resolutions, they have a number of federal standing resolutions. For example, federal standing resolution number 1, this has been, as far as I've been here, this has been their number 1 standing resolution from a federal side, and that's that Congress has never fully funded the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA. States are having to backfill that support more than the federal government is able to support. So that's been an ongoing standing resolution for CASB, and it will continue to be so until the federal government fully funds public education. So, does anybody have any questions before we get into all these resolution items? Okay. So each of these resolutions was proposed by an individual school district. So typically there will be an issue with the school district that they're facing and that they're wanting to create some legislation to fix issues that are going on in their specific district. You'll find that a lot of these resolutions aren't just unique to those school districts. They are issues that are impacting all school districts throughout the state. And so as part of CASB, there is a legislative resolution committee. So there's the delegate assembly, and then there's also the legislative resolution committee, the LRC. It's a smaller subsect of CASB's delegate assembly, and they actually work throughout the year in terms of lobbying for specific legislation. I sit on the LRC as a legislative liaison to provide some legal advice to the LRC. And so those are bi-monthly meetings that I sit in on. And so as part of this delegate assembly, they have forwarded recommendations to the delegate assembly, either favorable. They haven't had any that were opposed this year, but for the most part, they were either favorable or undecided in terms of their recommendation for how the delegate assembly should vote, either in favor or in opposition of these resolutions. So this resolution number 1, I'll go just talk about this a little bit more. Just so we're kind of on the same page about what these resolutions are, is costs to be considered in the new funding formula. This was submitted by the Telluride Board of Education. And really what they're looking at is to support legislation for the full and adequate funding of education through Colorado funding formula. And what they want to do is make sure that we're including actual costs in the funding formula. When I sat in on the LRC, what are actual costs? What they mean is to look at what it really costs to educate students and to adjust the funding formula appropriately. So it makes sense, right? We want to make sure that we're fully funding, and then we want to make sure that we're funding students as much as they should be funded. So it's a lot of these are fairly generic and make sense. And so LRC forwarded this with a favorable recommendation, and I also recommend that we support this. Resolution number 2, this is a referendum to mirror Initiative 33. If you don't know what Initiative 33 is, it was a carve-out for education under TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and it's really to address teacher retention and recruitment and to give more money to teachers specifically. So right now under TABOR, it would hold back a percentage of tax overpayment above the Tabor spending limits for specifically K-12 staff salaries. So if they were to, and by they meaning the General Assembly, were to create a ballot initiative or a ballot measure, it would mirror Initiative 33 to create that same carve out. So any of that additional money for Tabor that typically goes back to the taxpayers, there'd be a carve out percentage that would go directly to staff salaries. And by their estimation, that would increase all staff salaries throughout the state by $7,000 to $10,000 if this were passed. So LRC recommended, forwarded this with a favorable recommendation, and I also suggest that we support this. Any questions?
I have a comment on that
Oh,
one.
of course.
I actually canvassed for Initiative 63 last summer, trying to get enough signatures to get it on the ballot. It was, from my experience of canvassing, was widely popular. I think I had maybe out of 300 to 400 signatures, one person that I approached that was like, no, I'd rather not. So I think it didn't get on the ballot last time just for poor organization as far as gathering the signatures. But it really is a way to pay our teachers more without increasing taxes. And I think it's a great idea. So I was really happy to see it on here.
Yeah, and that, unfortunately, that's why 63 failed, is it didn't garner enough signatures. So now they're trying to go through the General Assembly route and have them create a ballot measure through the General Assembly process instead of going through the signature process. So I agree. I think it's really beneficial and could raise substantial revenue for our teachers. Resolution number 3, also forwarded with a favorable recommendation by CASB. That, again, this is to just fully fund the IDEA from the federal government side. And so this is really a call on our federal Congress people to fully fund the IDEA. Right now, Colorado districts are refunded 17 cents on the dollar. The IDEA requires a 40% refunding system, and that's just not happening. So we're continuing to backfill and support our most vulnerable students. The federal government needs to step up. Resolution number 4, this is another federal bill. I think it was actually introduced by a Colorado congressperson, Representative Joe, Neguse, thank you. Introduced the Secure Rural Schools and Community Self-Determination Act of 2000, and that's to provide funding from federal lands the Colorado school districts normally would not receive property taxes from. So really this is to support rural school districts who don't garner enough property tax support to fund their schools, and so this would provide additional resources for those rural school districts. LRC recommends favorable, and I also recommend that we support this. Resolution number 5, earlier adoption of the School Finance Act. This is my 4th year doing this with you all. This is the 4th time I've seen this resolution. This should just be a standing resolution, if anything. And I'm sure our CFO, Megan Sponsor, would agree that we need to adopt the School Finance Act earlier. This is to do it not later than 21 days prior to the last legislative session. We know all the complications that are associated with waiting until the very last day to pass the School Finance Act. And it can be really challenging to budget appropriately. And so we just hope that one day they will pass the School Finance Act earlier. Does anybody have any questions on those? Okay, resolution number 6, achieve national average level of public school funding. This is just really to urge lawmakers to ensure that the school finance formula is fully funded, and they want to make sure that we are at the national average by 2028. There were some pretty interesting statistics on this, that we are 35th in the country in per pupil funding, and we're among the last in all states in teacher pay compared to similarly situated professionals. So to get to 25th in the country, we would need to increase our per pupil funding by $1,263, and that's just to get to the halfway mark. So there is a significant need to increase funding in Colorado. So resolution number 7, rural factor added to the school finance formula. This is really to amend the school finance formula to include rural as a factor. Right now, they're doing a lot of one-year appropriations for rural school districts. We know that there have been a number of initiatives statewide, EE, for example, that have been passed to help support rural districts. This would really just amend the school finance formula altogether to create another factor for rural school districts to receive additional funding as an additional appropriation. Resolution number 8 is pretty straightforward, full pupil per pupil funding, and that's essentially to eliminate the budget stabilization factor by 2024, 2025. We are going in the right direction, so it seems very possible that we will get to that number by next school year. Resolution number 9, repeal of financial obligations. This was something that we had discussed last year. This has to do with the Claire Davis Act, and there are financial penalties associated with school districts who don't protect against known violent individuals who create harmful incidents at school. There could be personal liability for staff members, and of course there is district-wide liability for any injuries that occur. This is aimed at repealing any financial penalties because the incentive in that way doesn't work. And so LRC recommended a favorable recommendation, and I also still believe that we should support repealing those financial penalties. Any questions? Okay, moving right along to resolution number 10, curing open meetings law technical violations. So we know last year there was an open meetings law bill that was passed. Ultimately, it was vetoed by Governor Polis. And so this is just another attempt by CASB to support any legislation that would address violations of the open meetings law. This is really for technical violations of going into executive session. So for example, President Matthews reads the wrong statute. That could be a violation of the open meetings law and would subject us to a violation of that law. This would give us the opportunity to cure a violation, like a technical violation, like misreading the statute. It seems like a pretty harmless violation, but nonetheless, it's a violation under the law right now, and we would be subject to paying attorney's fees and things of that nature if we violate it, even for technical violations. Resolution number 11, independent oversight of the Department of Early Childhood. So right now, there is no independent oversight entity for CDEC, and so this would just aim to create legislation that would have an independent oversight entity for CDEC, much like CDE has an oversight entity for it. Resolution number 12, capture traffic violators with cameras on school bus stop arms. And this is really just develop statewide legislation allowing the use of stop arm camera videos, if available, to capture penalized traffic violators of stop arms on school buses. So there's nothing statewide. There are some states that have passed legislation to allow the use of stop arms on buses. Colorado is not one of them. And so this is just involving people who drive past buses when they're parked, and that's illegal. So now we're going to get into a couple of resolutions that weren't necessarily forwarded with a favorable recommendation. They were either undecided or there just wasn't time to get to all these. Nonetheless, they were still forwarded to the Delegate Assembly to discuss. Resolution number 13 is universal screeners for reading and math. And so really the idea here is to create universal screenings for all K through 3 students rather than for just some subsect of students who have been identified with reading deficiencies or things of that nature. It's my understanding that the READ Act doesn't have specific provisions related to dyslexia. And so this would aim to create legislation to ensure that dyslexic students also are accounted for in terms of universal screenings. Resolution number 14 is early literacy. This is just a number of proposed changes to address literacy in our legislation. So legislation should include such things as explicit intervention recommendations and progress monitoring, training and certification programs for classroom teachers, reading interventionists and literary specialists, as well as implementation of the recommendation of the state's dyslexia working group created by House Bill 19-1134. So there are probably going to be a lot of different types of legislation that are attempted to be passed this year that deal with early literacy, and this is something that we'll carefully monitor and discuss as legislation comes out. Resolution number 15, updates to P-TECH. Greeley Evans School District is one of, I believe, 20 districts in the state that offers a P-TECH program. It is an awesome program. And this is just really to create additional improvements to the P-TECH program. Some of those improvements include allow the funding model to pay for college classes starting in 9th grade. I believe right now it's 11th grade, 10th grade. Do we know? I'm looking over it.
We can start in 11th and 12th grade.
11th and 12th.
However, you can offer students concurrent enrollment in 9th and 10th, but P-TECH is 11th.
Okay, thank you. So this would allow funding for all the way down to 9th grade. It would remove the college opportunity fund caps. These are stipends that you get for in-state tuition. There's kind of a weird situation right now where students who are earning P-TECH credits might lose out on those stipends for the college opportunity fund caps. And so they would just remove that altogether. It would allow four-year institutions to collaborate as a higher education partner, and it would include P-TECH courses in the definition of concurrent enrollment. This was forwarded with a favorable recommendation, and I also believe that we should support this. Any questions? Any comments? Okay. I know it was a very hot executive session, so we're probably kind of tired right now. Resolution.
The temperature in the
Temperature
room.
in the room.
Let's be clear.
Sorry.
The temperature in the room.
Let's be clear.
Thank you.
It's a good 20 degrees cooler, I think, in this room.
That's an important piece of clarification.
It is 15 degrees cooler in here.
Resolution number 16, alternate measures to CMAS science. Right now, as required by the Every Student Succeeds Act, we must issue a science assessment. This is essentially just to waive out of that science assessment and to show some other way to demonstrate proficiency in the field of science. Same thing with resolution number 17 with social studies, to waive out of that requirement under the ESSA and determine some other type of way to demonstrate proficiency in the field of social studies.
So Nate, why did you do favorable on one and undecided on the other?
Oh, this is from the
This is what
legislative
CASB's
resolution.
saying.
Yeah, the CASB.
I wonder why they are doing that.
I'm not sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So as we said last year, there's a problem with the amount of the statistical data it's not providing, right? What we
Right.
need it to provide to see if kids are doing well in science or social studies, correct?
Right, yeah, and so, I mean, this is even just from the resolution booklet. It says, data from these exams do not provide timely information to drive instructional practices or otherwise improve educational opportunities and outcomes for students. So I think it's the same reasoning for both social studies and science, that perhaps there's a different or better way to demonstrate proficiency. Resolution number 18, new teacher mentoring. So right now there's a new teacher mentoring grant program, and this would aim to support legislation to make that new teacher mentoring program a permanent program to support new teachers. I do want to spend just a little bit of time on resolution number 19 because I am currently actively in the front lines and working on this one, and I would strongly support this particular resolution, and this is CASB resolution on House Bill 211110. CASB did, or the Legislative Resolution Committee did forward this with a favorable recommendation. So, and I could talk for hours about House Bill 211110, but just so you're aware, it is an online accessibility law that requires all governmental entities in the state of Colorado to come into compliance by July 1st of 2024. And this is really related to technology accessibility. So things like websites, but also our Board of Education meetings, anything that's posted, any online content, newsletters, communications to families, applications that students and staff are using, anything that staff are using to communicate with families, any technology you can possibly think of falls under House Bill 211110, and it needs to be accessible to any individual with a disability. So previously, under the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, it was only for individuals with visual impairments. This has been since expanded to all individuals with disabilities need to be supported by these online accessibility guidelines. A lot of this we're already doing as a state and as a federal government was requiring. Nonetheless, this is really expanding the world by which we must be providing accessible technologies to all individuals with disabilities. And it is a humongous overtaking I can see that Teresa Myers is shaking or nodding her head in agreement right now. Just to even document all of the vendors that we are using with software has been a challenge in itself. We are actively working right now with a committee to come up with a plan and to implement that and to come into compliance by July 1st of 2024. I am optimistic that we will come into compliance. Nonetheless, it's going to be a significant challenge and it's going to take a lot of work because this law really affects everybody. So, did you have a comment?
Do we have an idea of what the cost is for this? Do what? No.
We do not. I think right now we're just looking at vendors to audit all of the software that we have to determine whether or not it meets the guidelines. So the guidelines we have to meet are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And so we're going to do an internal audit of all of our technology to determine whether or not it meets these WCAG guidelines. And that in itself could cost $10,000 to $20,000 just to do the audit. I mean, that's just a total guesstimate, but it could be a pretty significant undertaking. And then if we have to get new vendors who don't meet these WCAG guidelines, that could be an additional cost. I do know that we are kind of working on updating our website, and so any kind of new content, new information that we're creating moving forward will be in compliance, but it's really dealing with all the older technology that we have.
And it
all the
includes all of
content.
our schools, including our charter schools. Whereas, you know, they operate all their own websites, and so it's a big lift. It's a big lift. And I mean, it's every flyer, it's every piece of information we send home or send anywhere.
Yeah, and the other complicating factor is that the state told us a week or two ago that the rulemaking on this isn't even going to be done till February, and we have to implement by July. And we asked if there was going to be a delay then in the implementation. They said no. So we're
Right.
trying, but it's a lot.
And that's the other, like, kind of frustrating part about this is that local governments or, just any governmental agency needs to be in compliance with OIT, the Office for Information Technology's guidelines and rules, but the rules aren't going to come out until next February. So, I mean, we know that we need to follow these web content accessibility guidelines, but in terms of what specifically we need to follow, we don't know. And so we're just right now just trying our best to just abide by all of the guidelines, and maybe these rules will make it a little bit more lenient. So all that being said, this resolution is aimed at supporting any legislation that would delay the enforcement from that July 1st, 2024 deadline until at least 2 years after OIT sets its rules. So it'd be from February of 2024, 2 years from then, which would give us a lot more time, and that would be really, really helpful to make sure that we are fully compliant. There are also some remediation issues. Right now, there are some monetary penalties if we fail to come into compliance. There are individual plaintiff awards if we fail to come into compliance, but there's not really an opportunity to cure a violation. And so I imagine that one of those remediation processes will be to give local governments the opportunity to cure a violation before we would be subject to any monetary penalty. And then perhaps they would just create a waiver for school districts altogether. I find that to be a fairly lofty dream, but nonetheless, that is something that they would seek and support, and of course that's something that we would seek and support as well. Nonetheless, we are working to come into compliance by July 1st of 2024, whether or not there is any legislation. So
Once we know what the rules are in
We'll see.
February.
Yeah, we'll
We'll have
see.
a good 5 months to get that done.
we'll see how willing we are to come into compliance at that point. But I imagine, and I know that every school district is dealing with this right now. Really, Aurora Public Schools has been at the forefront of guiding school districts on best steps and best practices and what to do. And we're really leaning on Aurora Public Schools right now. But most school districts are in the same place as we are, if not well behind where we are right now.
So if we don't meet that deadline and this doesn't pass through, what kind of ramifications are there?
So there's individual monetary penalties. So you could be subject to a monetary fine for a violation. You could be subject to attorney's fees, and you could be subject to, I think it's a $3,500 violation per violation. So an individual plaintiff could bring a case saying this app isn't compliant with these guidelines, and then they would be awarded $3,500 in addition to attorney's fees. And it's really unclear about if multiple plaintiffs can complain about one violation, do they each get awarded? So there's a number of violations. And then the other one would be injunctive relief, which essentially means that we would just need to come into compliance. So that's what's the remediation process for now. And I think that they're planning to pass or support legislation that would kind of change that.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on this one? So, Director Mash, just come in, very much supporting this one and yell as loud as you can. Resolution number 20, best funding for early childhood classroom construction. So right now, best funding does not support the construction of safe, appropriate, and adequate classrooms for early childhood, and this would just expand that. And then Resolution 21, full and sustainable funding for best. This one just really speaks for itself, that it's not being fully funded and that they are looking to pass legislation to ensure that it is fully funding and that it remains sustainable for years to come. Resolution number 22, housing for educational professionals. This was submitted by the Telluride Board of Education, so I think that they probably have a little bit different interest in terms of affordable housing for where their school district is located. Nonetheless, this would be for any legislation that deals with housing programs would support education staff, K-12 staff, in seeking and obtaining affordable housing. Resolution number 23, this would be to increase the minimum wage for all teachers across the state to $45,000. That is not an issue here, but that is an issue elsewhere in other school districts. Resolution number 24, mill levy override options. So this would be to create additional funding flexibility for MLOs that are passed. Right now, there's a cap of 25% of districts for their total program funding to authorize local property tax revenue that may be authorized by voters. It can't exceed 25%. This would support legislation that would increase that cap to 30% and to use that additional revenue to support teacher salaries specifically. Resolution number 25, sustainability of the Colorado Intergenerational Public School Land Trust Fund. This is really just greater flexibility related to the permanent fund. I'm going to be completely honest with you all. I don't quite understand this resolution. And so, Director Mash, I would just encourage you to learn as much as you can and to use your best judgment in terms of supporting or opposing this particular resolution. I'm not sure if anybody had any specific comments on resolution number 25.
That's the only one I felt like I couldn't wrap my head around as well.
Yeah, and I think that really it's just to find ways to invest, flexible ways to invest and to ensure that it is sustainable for years to come. Resolution number 26, sustainability of the Building Excellent Schools Today grant program. And this is really, again, kind of similar to 25 to allow for opportunities for impact investing to ensure that the best program is funded fully and sustainable for many years to come. Also one that was a little bit challenging to understand.
Nate, are marijuana tax dollars part of the BEST program, or is that something completely different?
I'm not totally sure.
I thought that was.
They are.
Yeah, they have been.
Okay. So that's just a piece of the funding of the BEST program.
And they've not generated near the amount of revenue that was anticipated would be generated from the marijuana sales.
Mm-hmm. That's probably a good thing.
Resolution number 27 is protecting local control of PPR from state initiative grants. So really this is dealing with appropriations as well as unfunded mandates. So we know that oftentimes the General Assembly will just create grant programs and other ways that school districts can apply for more funding, and ultimately money goes away from the general fund to support these other grant programs, and this is essentially an ask to get rid of those grant programs and eliminate those resources to the maximum extent possible so that we can fully fund our schools. Resolution number 28 is fairly similar, opposing legislation that usurps local control of instruction vested by the Colorado Constitution and elected school boards. So this is more related to unfunded mandates or mandates that school districts are forced to comply with certain rules, and it strips local control away from school boards like you all, and ultimately that is a violation of local control. So ultimately, CASB is supporting any legislation that would continue to keep local control with the school boards and not giving it to the state. Resolution number 29, support for school district construction impact fees. So right now, school districts are prohibited from collecting impact fees on new developments. We know that, for example, fire departments can collect impact fees for new developments. Right now, we just have cash in lieu fees that we can collect for any new residential developments, which essentially means that when residential development comes in and they plan to have 200 homes, that would likely increase the number of students in our district, and so we receive fees from those property developers when they are developing properties. This would work kind of similarly where we could collect impact fees from those developers as well to help support our students, because new developments ultimately are going to impact our school districts because we're going to get more students that we need to support. Resolution number 30, resolution to increase the BEST program's capacity to fund new school projects. This is really just to explore funding mechanisms to create ongoing revenue streams. Resolution number 31, no cell phone use in school zones. This would be to create statewide legislation to increase fines for cell phone use while operating a vehicle in a school zone. Right now, there's just you can't use your cell phone law, but there's not one that specifically you can't use a cell phone in a school zone that would have an increased fine attached to it. Resolution number 32 would be updates to the Colorado Open Records Act. This is really dealing with responding to Colorado Open Records Act requests. I do manage our CORA requests. We do get a lot of CORA requests, not to the extent that some other school districts do get open records requests. Nonetheless, we do get a lot. And so this would just make some changes to the Colorado Open Records Act. This was forwarded with a favorable recommendation by the LRC. This is to increase the reasonable time from 3 days to 7 days, and then it would increase the extension from 7 days to 14 days. And that would give us more time to ensure that we're getting all documents responsive to the request in a timely fashion and not asking for extensions. It would increase the fees that could be charged to an individual who's making a request. We could prioritize requests made by media outlets, and then of course any personally identifiable information, just adding protections for the release of PII. Oftentimes we get requests that include student information. We have to redact that information, of course, but this would just ensure that those protections are in place, statutorily speaking. Any comments or questions? We're almost done. Resolution number 33, update to state hiring laws. So right now there are some prohibitions written into law for those convicted of offenses against children. However, there's different rules for licensed versus non-licensed employees. This would clean that up to create the same rules for licensed and non-licensed employees. It would also require that anybody convicted of a misdemeanor child offense, that they would also be prohibited or further restricted from working with children. And this would also require that any staff who does receive a charge while they're employed must report that information, especially if it relates to any offense against a child. I will say that the LRC did not take a favorable recommendation. This is one that I would encourage that we support. Resolution number 34, support for economic freedom in impartial classrooms. So this came out from the Colorado Education Association. The statewide union issued a resolution that essentially was condemning capitalism. This would be CASB taking a separate stance and to not back CEA's resolution condemning capitalism and take a firm stance that capitalism is inherently good and has done a lot of good things for society, and that we shouldn't back CEA's resolution. I don't know what that looks like in terms of legislation, quite frankly. It's more political in many ways, but ultimately I think it's just the delegate assembly wanting to back away from CEA in some of the positions that they are currently taking. Resolution number 35, guardrails for artificial intelligence use in education environments. We're going to be talking about AI during the business meeting. Just so you're aware, and I'll kind of spoiler alert right now, there aren't any guardrails for artificial intelligence. There is no legislation federally or statewide speaking when it comes to AI use in classrooms. Given that generative AI is moving rather quickly, ideally there needs to be some guardrails in place sooner rather than later. And so that's kind of what this resolution is aimed towards, passing legislation. Resolution number 36, Student Safety Risk Assessment Tool. So under the Claire Davis Act, we need to conduct threat assessments. This would create a more structured framework for evaluating the potential readmission of these students. It would be to create a data-driven risk assessment tool. And I'll just look at it. It's called the Colorado Actuarial Risk Assessment Scale, CARAS, is what they use for individuals who are on parole. It's what the parole board uses in terms of determining whether or not somebody is likely to go back to jail. And it is I would say, an objective assessment to determine whether or not individuals are likely to commit a crime again. And so this legislation would aim to create something similar for individuals in their likelihood to commit harm. It is a wild idea, but I think that it does create a lot more objectivity in the way threat assessments are conducted, and it could benefit us in a lot of ways, especially as it relates to individual and district-wide liability under the Claire Davis Act. And so, of course, we don't want to make assessments work like prisons, but we do want to create some kind of objective assessment tool to determine whether or not it's appropriate to bring a student back or to come up with some other kind of protections to make sure that they're not going to harm anybody else. So that's kind of what that's related to. And then last, I believe, is special education teacher licensing. This is to create alternative pathways for experienced teachers to receive licensure in special education and early childhood special education. So right now there are a number of requirements in order to obtain your special education licensure. What this would do is it would just make an alternative pathway for a current licensed teacher to obtain a special education certificate. So if they have their professional teaching license and they pass the praxis exam, then that would be the equivalent of getting a 3-year initial license in special education or early childhood education. This is just an idea to help support special education staff. They are really our most needed staff, and a group of staff that are going away rather quickly. And so this is just an alternative means to get more teachers in the door to support our special education students. So, anybody have any questions or comments?
Phew.
Appreciate this.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Great.
Go back to that last, sorry.
Go ahead, you go first.
Nate, can you go back to the last one that you just, special education licensing? I mean, is there a downside to that? I mean, obviously, it's less education, but is it, is that one we should support just by way of getting more special education?
We should support it, shouldn't we, Tom? What do you,
So when I read that, it just sounds like you can test in to
Right.
a special education position, which is a pretty low bar.
to test into the licensure?
Yes, if you have a professional license and you pass a test, you're in the club.
Yeah.
That to me is a really low bar. I would love to get them started, and they have to complete maybe a modified program. I'd like to see a little bit more teeth on that.
So maybe they
Okay.
can teach, you would support teaching with the praxis, but while they're teaching, so kind of like an alternative licensure program does,
Yeah.
where they're doing the coursework while they're teaching.
Yeah, TEE
Yeah.
kind of
Okay.
that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that bar seems really, really low.
Okay, that's what I was curious about. Thank you, Tom.
That's helpful. And I will say that in their rationale statement, this was submitted by St. Vrain, that districts could hire such licensed teacher with the obligation to provide a tailored induction program in their first year. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure kind of what that would look like, but I would imagine that if they were to create an alternative pathway, that it would come with some pretty significant protections. Because it is, from a liability perspective, it is,
It's a huge area
yeah.
when it comes to litigation. I mean, I don't know, it used to be before we hired an attorney, and I used to pretend to be the attorney. Special ed was the highest litigated area in education.
It still is, yep. With or without me.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
I didn't mean just here. I meant like in the state of Colorado, Nate.
No, I don't take it personally. It's okay. But I would say for 36 and 37, these are both resolutions that I would suggest we support. But.
I was just going to say, maybe I'm just nerdy, but I enjoy the delegate assembly. So if anyone wants to come in the future or be the delegate, there's always robust discussion. So whoever puts forth the resolution, so Poudre School District stands up and says, here's the rationale behind our resolution, here's why we're supporting it. And then I think last year was the most, I mean, it went on and on, but it was really interesting. I mean, so, and also to hear the perspective of rural school districts versus bigger school districts on some of these different issues. Like sometimes you didn't even realize that a small school district might have this, but it's just really fascinating. Everyone usually is very well spoken and polite. Occasionally you get someone real passionate and not very nice, just adds, it's just fascinating. And I mean, I would say it's government, right? But it's just our little mini version of it with the school board. So
Can I ask you a question then? So do you go down there with the suggestions for being favorable or unfavorable, and then when do you get down there though and you hear more into it, do you ever change the vote for our district?
I don't think I have changed the vote very often, maybe once or twice, but usually I have, maybe texted for some additional information, or does this have to do with us? And if I am not sure, then I'll just abstain from the vote.
And so Natalie, when you text, you're typically checking in with Nate or with me.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not necessarily asking for opinion, but just more information.
Yeah.
Just like.
And we can often reach out to our lobbyist also for yet additional information, like where's this coming from, to better understand some of these.
Because a lot of times there was a very specific situation in a school district that made them want this very specific change, and it might not always. That's why, like the consent agenda, the first 12, they put it on a consent agenda because the Legislative Resolutions Committee is just pretty darn sure that these are universal. Everybody will be behind, funding special education or funding this or that safety program. And then the ones that are a little more up for discussion. But yeah, I mean, when we have these conversations, I bring the will of the board, and I vote according to our discussion.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Mr. Fall? Any other suggestions? Anything? All right.
I will, we'll go back to the one-pagers for the actual legislative session, but there's a lot of resolutions to get through, so thank you.
Thank you. And we have you down on the agenda twice, Mr. Fall, but I don't think you've covered both of those, correct?
I think it's the same thing.
Okay. All right, so we're to
And we'll
debrief
start over.
the work session. And Ms. Sullivan, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Fall, for breaking those down for us, because that's a lot of information, and you always do a great presentation on those, so thank you.
I echo those sentiments. It never ceases to amaze me how informed you are, and we really appreciate it.
Ms. Mash?
Yes, thank you very much. It's always good to get the rationale. It's not always in the booklet, so you give us some more detailed information. And also glad that we got to have our discussion on Dr. Pilch's evaluation.
Mr. Bentley?
Yeah, same. Thanks, Nate. That's always a ton. It's not my favorite area of discussion, but it's amazing how much goes into all that, especially like going to the legislation with CASB and listen to them and how detailed and complex all of it is, and it's a lot of moving parts and pieces, and some of these come every year and some are brand new and wild, and the amount of effect and what it can do and can't do for our district is just mind-boggling. So thanks for keeping up and keeping us informed. So thank you.
Dr. Campos-Pittsy?
Actually, in Dr. Pilch's evaluation, one of the things in my written evaluation that I wrote was, thank you for hiring such competent people such as Nate Fall. So the fact that you can break down 38 resolutions for us and make them super digestible, just applaud you for that. And I'm a policy nerd, so I read all these, and you did a great job. And the only one I was confused about, I'm glad we're both confused about. So,
Ms. Pepys?
Nothing different. Thank you, as always, for your information.
Yeah, and I don't have anything to add either. Again, echo everyone's thanks to you, Nate, and appreciate you guys and our work, our executive session and the superintendent's evaluation. So our work session is now adjourned, and we'll see everyone back at 6 o'clock for the business meeting.